While war is often declared on the battlefield, its foundations are frequently laid years earlier, through the silent movements of capital within institutions like the Bank of England. Most of us blame Hitler's brewery rants or the collapse of diplomacy for the horrors of World War II. But those are just the visible ripples on the surface. Beneath the historic handshakes lay a meticulously calibrated financial engine, one that turned the unthinkable into a catastrophic reality. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the documented truth, buried within the Bank of England's declassified archives, the chilling entries of the U.S. Morgenthau diaries, and the cold records of the British Parliament. To understand how a single institution could hold the world's fate in its grip by the 1930s, we have to trace its extraordinary rise. It began in 1694. A group of private creditors struck a deal with the king to bankroll a war, and in exchange, they seized control of an empire's economic lifeblood. What started as a private joint stock company soon became the absolute cornerstone of the British imperial system. The definitive turning point came in 1844. With the Bank Charter Act, this institution gained a near-total monopoly on printing money, tethering the nation's destiny to the gold locked in its vaults. It's a legacy that spans centuries, from handwritten 17th-century receipts to the modern polymer notes featuring King Charles III, issued as recently as June 2024. But here is the crucial detail. Until its nationalization in 1946, this immense, state-like power was held entirely in private hands. No public oversight, no government interference, only the interests of shareholders and the cold calculations of a private boardroom. This environment of unchecked, private authority built the perfect stage for the most controversial era in financial history, a time when numbers on a ledger proved more destructive than any artillery fire. Welcome to the Bank of England, a fortress of secrets that helped shape and shatter the world as we know it. But every fortress, no matter how cold its stones, is driven by the heartbeat of the individuals within its walls. To uncover the bank's most shadowed era, we must first look into the eyes of the man who ruled it like a ghost for a quarter of a century. Our story, then, begins with a figure whose very image became a source of such profound controversy that decades later, an incoming governor of the Bank of England felt compelled to order its removal from the wall. His name was Montagu Norman. Born in 1871 into the rarefied air of Britain's upper-crust banking aristocracy, Norman's destiny was intertwined with the Bank of England from birth. His own grandfather, Sir Mark Wilkes Colley, had once held the esteemed position of the bank's governor. Norman received a privileged education at the elite Eton College, briefly attended Cambridge University, and then swiftly ascended through the exclusive ranks of the financial world, making his mark on both sides of the Atlantic. He spent formative years in New York, immersing himself in the intricacies of American banking houses, developing an innate understanding of the transatlantic financial currents that would ultimately define his extraordinary career. By 1920, he had achieved the pinnacle of his profession, becoming the governor of the Bank of England, a role he would retain for an astonishing, uninterrupted 24 years, making him the longest-serving governor in the bank's modern history. His influence was, in a word, unparalleled. Yet Norman was no archetypal buttoned-up central banker, confined to his office and numbers. He was an eccentric, almost theatrical figure, known for his distinctive attire, a broad-brimmed hat that often cast his face in shadow and a flowing cape that billowed behind him like a character from a Gothic novel. He cultivated an air of mystique, frequently traveling under an array of pseudonyms, and often booking passage on transatlantic ocean liners under the name Professor Clarence Skinner, purely to evade the relentless scrutiny of journalists and the prying eyes of the markets. He suffered from severe nervous breakdowns, disappearing for weeks at a time to recuperate in the tranquil countryside or upon the vast, anonymous expanse of the sea. The Wall Street Journal, recognizing his singular power, once famously dubbed him the currency dictator of Europe, and a characterization he did not deny by his own admission to the court of the Bank of England on March 21, 1930. The renowned economist John Maynard Keynes, with characteristic wit, once remarked of Norman that he was always absolutely charming, always absolutely wrong. However, beneath the surface of his charismatic eccentricity lay a far more profound and dark truth. Norman had effectively constructed a financial bridge between London and the emerging specter of Nazi Berlin. His most significant partnership was not with any British politician, but with Hjalmar Schacht. The fateful intersection of their two brilliant but radical intellects paved the road to the deadliest conflict in recorded history. To truly comprehend how the venerable Bank of England became inextricably entangled with the terrifying rise of Nazi Germany, one must first grasp the sheer scale of the financial disaster that engulfed and drowned Europe in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. For the seeds of World War II were not sown in the fateful year of 1939. They were, in fact, planted with chilling precision in 1919, at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. With the stroke of a pen, the Allied powers, victorious yet vengeful, demanded that Germany pay astronomical reparations for the unprecedented devastation of the war. The final figure, a staggering 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to $33 billion at the time, was an astronomical sum, a burden that many economists, including the prescient John Maynard Keynes himself, warned was simply impossible for Germany to ever realistically repay. Keynes, with remarkable foresight, penned a scathing critique titled "The Economic Consequences of the Peace," in which he chillingly predicted that demanding such punishing reparations would not only utterly destroy the German economy, but would also, inevitably, sow the virulent seeds of future conflict. History would prove him horrifyingly, tragically right. By 1923, Germany's economy had not merely faltered. It had imploded into a state of hyperinflation so severe, so surreal, that its currency became virtually worthless. People would burn banknotes for warmth, for the sheer monetary value of the paper was less than that of firewood. The German mark, which had traded at a relatively stable 8 to the US dollar before the war, plummeted to an incomprehensible 4.2 trillion to the dollar by November 1923. That is not a typographical error. It was indeed trillion. Entire life savings, accumulated over generations of diligent work, evaporated into thin air overnight. Pensioners who had toiled their entire lives found themselves utterly destitute, unable to afford even a simple loaf of bread. Citizens would rush to spend their meager wages the very moment they received them, knowing full well that the money would lose half its value by the afternoon. Wheelbarrows, overflowing with stacks of cash, were insufficient to purchase a week's worth of groceries. It was economic annihilation on a scale that is almost impossible for the modern mind to fully comprehend, and a national trauma that left an indelible scar. And it was this profound, pervasive despair that created the kind of desperate, angry, and deeply humiliated population, a perfect tinderbox that was ripe for exploitation by any extremist demagogue promising salvation. Now, here is where the story takes a critical, pivotal turn. The audacious solution to this spiraling crisis did not emerge solely from the often stymied halls of European diplomacy. It came, instead, from the powerful nexus of American bankers and, crucially, from the Bank of England. And the enigmatic figure who masterfully bridged these disparate worlds was Hjalmar Schacht. Born in 1877 to staunchly pro-American parents who had actually lived in the United States, Schacht possessed a brilliant, incisive mind. His parents, so enamored with America, had even bestowed upon him the middle names Horace Greeley, in homage to the famed American newspaper editor. When Schacht was later subjected to psychological testing at the Nuremberg trials, he scored an extraordinary 143 on an IQ test, the highest of any Nazi leader examined. He was a tall, commanding presence, radiating an almost palpable aura of authority that inspired trust, almost instinctively, in those he encountered. In 1923, just a week after Hitler's pathetic failed beer hall putsch in Munich, Schacht was appointed Germany's currency commissioner. He inherited a national treasury devoid of gold reserves. The German currency was, quite literally, nothing more than worthless toilet paper. But Schacht understood something profoundly fundamental about money, a truth that most people, even today, fail to fully grasp. Money doesn't rely on actual, intrinsic value. It relies instead on perceived value, on an almost mythical confidence, on the collective belief that a mere piece of paper or a number entered into a ledger actually signifies something real, and enduring. Shocked, the financial illusionist knew precisely how to manufacture that belief. Shocked understood a fundamental truth that many overlook. Money is not a physical commodity, but a psychological one. Its value is anchored entirely in public confidence. By mastering the art of perceived value, he proved that a central banker's greatest tool is not the gold in the vault, but the ability to manage the collective belief of a nation, a principle that remains the bedrock of modern monetary policy today. And this is where the Bank of England decisively enters the picture, with consequences that would ripple across continents and decades. Shocked, through his persuasive intellect and charm, convinced Montagu Norman to lend Germany a crucial $25 million to establish a nascent gold reserve. The mere existence of that reserve, the ability to simply point to it and declare, "There is gold backing our currency," proved sufficient to restore a foundational degree of confidence in the ravaged German economy. It was as much a psychological operation as it was a financial one, and it worked brilliantly. The hyperinflation, which had devoured a nation, finally ended. A new, stable currency, the Reichsmark, was successfully introduced. And, most crucially, this shared success cemented a powerful personal bond between Schacht and Norman, a bond that would ultimately prove far more consequential than any treaty or trade agreement ever signed in any capital. Norman and Schacht's relationship transcended mere professional courtesy. They became genuine, close, even intimate friends. Their bond was forged in the manner of powerful men of that era, solidified over shared meals in exclusive clubs, long, contemplative walks through secluded estates, and the quiet, almost conspiratorial confidence that blossoms from the shared knowledge of controlling the intricate levers of entire national economies. Both men were prominent members of the Anglo-German Fellowship, a British organization that, disturbingly, openly advocated for friendship and cooperation with Hitler's Germany. Norman's closeness to the Schacht family was such that he became godfather to one of Schacht's grandchildren. In a telling gesture of profound respect and affection, that grandchild was named Norman in his honor. But this intimacy was more than a mere personal bond. It was the foundation of a shared global vision that would soon manifest in a complex, circular machinery of debt and gold. Now, let's explore how this extraordinary friendship translated into concrete action on a global scale. For Norman and Schacht were not merely sharing pleasant dinners. They were, in essence, co-architects constructing the very financial infrastructure of the nascent 20th century. In late 1923, as Germany teetered precariously on the precipice of total economic collapse, the Allied Reparation Commission formed a committee of international experts, tasked with devising a plan to restart Germany's critical reparation payments. The committee was chaired by Charles Dawes, an American banker who, significantly, also served as a director of one of the banks within the sprawling J.P. Morgan empire. The resulting framework, famously known as the Dawes Plan, was formally adopted in 1924, and Montagu Norman was one of its key, albeit behind the scenes, architects, working in close concert with Schacht to design a sophisticated system that would channel vast amounts of American and British capital directly into Germany. The Dawes Plan meticulously restructured Germany's reparation obligations, initially setting payments at 1 billion gold marks per year, gradually increasing to 2.5 billion by 1928. But its truly revolutionary and most important feature was the provision of a massive, stabilizing loan. Germany received 800 million Reichsmarks, roughly $200 million, specifically earmarked to stabilize its volatile currency and to rebuild its shattered industrial base. A substantial half of that money was raised through Wall Street bond issues, with J.P. Morgan taking the lead in floating the loan on the eager American market, where it was quickly oversubscribed. American investors, enticed by the significantly higher interest rates offered on German bonds compared to more sedate domestic investments, poured billions of dollars into Germany. This influx created a circular flow of capital so intricate, so almost absurd in its design, that it defied traditional economic logic. American banks loaned money to Germany. Germany, in turn, used that money to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain, then, used those very reparation payments to repay their own colossal war debts to the United States. So, American money flowed into Germany, traversed back through France and Britain, and ultimately ended up right back in the coffers of American banks. It was a giant financial merry-go-round, spinning merrily along, and as long as American money continued to flow in, everyone, it seemed, remained content. Over the next few years, this ingenious, self-sustaining system pumped billions into the revitalized German economy. By 1929, the cumulative loans extended to Germany under the Dawes Plan and its subsequent iteration, the Young Plan, had swelled to exceed $3 billion, while the total amount paid by the Allies back to the United States during that same period was only about $2.6 billion. The net flow of capital was overwhelmingly into Germany, not out of it. And that colossal sum of money didn't merely languish in bank vaults. It rebuilt and revitalized German industry. It modernized German factories with cutting-edge technology. It funded the very infrastructure, roads, railways, power plants, that would, with chilling efficiency, must later be converted to massive military production. On the surface, it appeared to be a financial miracle. But in reality, the entire German revival was built upon a foundation of sand, waiting for a single tide to wash it all away. Yet this seemingly robust system harbored a fatal inherent flaw. It was entirely dependent on the uninterrupted flow of American loans. And when the stock market catastrophically crashed in October 1929, plunging the United States into the Great Depression, and that vital flow of capital ceased, almost literally, overnight. The consequences for Germany were immediate, brutal, and devastating. German banks, deprived of their financial lifeline, began to fail en masse. Unemployment, which had steadily declined during the Golden Twenties period of 1924 to 1929, exploded from roughly 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932, a staggering increase that crippled the nation. Industrial production plummeted into freefall. The fragile democratic coalition that had painstakingly governed the Weimar Republic fractured irrevocably under the immense, unrelenting pressure. German voters, having already endured the profound trauma of hyperinflation in 1923 and now confronting the widespread despair of mass unemployment, began to turn, in droves, to the radical political extremes, both the Communist Party on the far left and, more ominously, the Nazi Party on the far right. And here lies a critical, yet often overlooked, detail that many historians have noted, but that rarely receives the attention it so profoundly deserves. The massive foreign debt that Germany had so enthusiastically accumulated during the Dawes Plan period actually made the Great Depression significantly worse in Germany than it might otherwise have been. Germany had borrowed an astounding 29 billion Reichsmarks between 1924 and 1929. When the American loans were abruptly called in, the German banks and businesses that had become utterly reliant on that easy credit were left fatally exposed, vulnerable to collapse. The resulting financial crisis was more severe, more destabilizing, and far more politically explosive than it would ever have been without the crushing mountain of foreign debt that the Dawes and Young plans had so enthusiastically encouraged. In other words, the very financial system that Montagu Norman and the Anglo-American banking establishment had so carefully designed, with the stated intention of stabilizing Germany, ultimately ended up destabilizing it, catastrophically. And the horrifying political beneficiary of that profound destabilization was none other than Adolf Hitler. While the streets of Berlin burned with political unrest, the architects of the financial world were busy erecting a new, even more impenetrable fortress, one that would function far above the chaos of national borders. In 1929, amidst this growing global economic turmoil, a new committee was convened under the chairmanship of Owen D. Young, the distinguished head of General Electric, tasked with forging a permanent settlement for Germany's reparations. The resulting Young Plan, adopted in 1930, further reduced Germany's total reparations to 112 billion Reichsmarks, now payable over an astonishing 58 years, extending all the way through 1988. But, more significantly for our narrative, the Young Plan brought into existence a groundbreaking new institution specifically designed to manage these complex international payments, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. The BIS was officially established in 1930, headquartered in the neutral territory of Basel, Switzerland. On its surface, its stated purpose was benign, to manage Germany's reparation payments. However, Norman and Schacht had conceived and designed it to be something far more ambitious, far more powerful. As Norman, with characteristic zeal, enthusiastically described it as an elite club of central bankers. Schacht, with a touch of his usual boastfulness, claimed that not a single member of the young conference would refuse to claim the idea as his own. The BIS was intended to be nothing less than the central bank of central banks, a secluded and powerful forum where the men who controlled the money supply of entire nations could meet privately, forge secret deals, and coordinate global financial policy without any interference whatsoever from elected governments or the curious eyes of the general public. To ensure this club remained untouchable, its creators needed to place it beyond the reach of the law itself. And the pivotal feature of the BIS, and this is absolutely critical to understanding everything that follows, was that it was meticulously designed to be utterly immune from governmental interference. When Norman consulted Walter Layton, the insightful editor of The Economist at the time, about drafting the BIS charter in such a way that it would protect the institution from political meddling, Layton, a democratically minded individual, told him it simply couldn't be done, emphasizing that it's the right of every democratic government to reserve its freedom of action. Yet, Norman and Schacht, driven by their vision of an independent financial elite, found a way regardless. The BIS was granted a unique set of legal protections that effectively placed it above national law. Its accounts could not be seized. Its officers could not be arrested. Its records were inviolable. It operated in a kind of financial twilight zone, an extraterritorial entity answerable to no single nation, no parliament, and no democratic body on earth. The founding members of the BIS included the central banks of Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Belgium, as well as influential private American banks deeply connected to the sprawling Morgan Empire. Significantly, while the Federal Reserve Bank of New York worked diligently to establish the BIS, it was not listed as a founder. Instead, the U.S. was represented by the First National Bank of New York, J.P. Morgan and Company, and the First National Bank of Chicago, all integral parts of the Morgan financial network. Japan was also represented by its own powerful private banks. The extraterritorial sanctuary of the BIS provided more than just a safe space for secret meetings. It became the quiet laboratory where the financial lifelines of a dying democracy would be rerouted to fuel a rising dictatorship. Now, with all this elaborate financial infrastructure meticulously in place, let us fast forward to the early 1930s, a period when the dire consequences of these arrangements became truly catastrophic. Following the Wall Street crash of 1929, the circular flow of capital that had so artificially sustained the German economy completely collapsed. The Federal Reserve and J.P. Morgan ceased their lending to Germany. In September 1931, Britain itself, facing its own economic crisis, had abandoned the gold standard, a decision that fundamentally destroyed the international payment system and effectively severed what little remained of the financial lifeline to the struggling Weimar Republic. Germany was plunged back into an even deeper, more desperate depression. Unemployment soared to an unprecedented 6 million souls. The fragile democratic government, already weakened, was now fatally undermined. But here is what very few people discuss, and a shocking counterpoint to the narrative of economic collapse. While the legitimate, democratic government of Germany was being slowly and painfully financially strangled, the nascent Nazi Party was experiencing a sudden, dramatic, and deeply suspicious influx of cash. In September 1930, fueled by substantial donations from powerful German industrialists like Fritz Thyssen, the chemical conglomerate IG Farben, and coal magnate Emil Kirdorf, the Nazi Party garnered an astounding 6.4 million votes, vaulting them to second place in the Reichstag. After that crucial electoral breakthrough, money from abroad began flowing in with increasing urgency, a steady stream that seemed to defy logic. And the critical connecting link between Germany's major industrialists and these foreign financiers was none other than Hjalmar Schacht, Montagu Norman's dear friend. By 1932, despite its burgeoning popularity, the Nazi Party was actually facing serious financial trouble. Adolf Hitler had spent lavishly on his private army, the SA, Sturmabteilung or Storm Detachment, and on his increasingly extravagant campaign operations, and he was drowning in debt. According to Otto Lehmann Russbult, writing in his incisive 1934 book Aggression, Hitler was invited to a discreet, highly consequential meeting at the Schroeder Bank in Cologne on January 4, 1933. At this pivotal gathering, leading industrialists and bankers, including the ever-present Schacht, effectively bailed Hitler out of his dire financial difficulties, enabling him to cover his enormous debts. In return, Hitler, ever the pragmatist, promised to crush the power of the trade unions, a promise he brutally fulfilled on May 2, 1933. Present at that January 4th meeting, according to multiple historical accounts, were also the influential Dulles brothers, John Foster and Allen, as of the prestigious New York law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which represented the Schroeder Bank. John Foster Dulles would, years later, become the powerful U.S. Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles would become the first civilian director of the CIA. Now, according to some historical accounts, including pioneering research by Yuri Rupsov and corroborating documentation, there was also a meeting on January 4, 1932, a full year earlier, between Montagu Norman, Adolf Hitler, and Franz von Papen, at which an agreement on financing the Nazi Party was allegedly reached. It is important to note that this specific claim is contested by some mainstream historians, and the exact details remain a matter of ongoing debate and scholarly contention. But what is not debated, and what stands as an undeniable truth, is the broader, overarching pattern. British and American financial interests were deeply, intimately intertwined with Germany's economic and political trajectory in the critical years leading up to Hitler's ascent. And Montagu Norman, with his unique blend of power and influence, stood firmly at the very center of those intricate, shadowy connections. What transpired immediately after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933 is well documented and beyond dispute. Schacht, indispensable to the Nazi economic vision, was almost immediately reappointed as President of the Reichsbank on March 17th. In May 1933, Schacht embarked on a crucial diplomatic mission to the United States, where he met with President Franklin Roosevelt and major Wall Street bankers, successfully securing a credit deal worth roughly $1 billion. The very next month, Schacht traveled to London, where he met once again with his old friend, Montagu Norman. The British, surprisingly amenable, has agreed to provide approximately $2 billion in additional loans to Hitler's Germany. And here is the truly remarkable, almost unbelievable part. The British raised absolutely no objections to Germany's audacious decision to simply stop paying reparations. Let that profound irony sink in for a moment. The democratic Weimar Republic had been mercilessly crushed, its economy utterly destroyed, and its people driven to the depths of desperation, largely because it couldn't keep up with the crushing burden of reparation payments. But when Hitler's newly installed Nazi government simply announced that it would unilaterally cease paying, the Bank of England and the broader British financial establishment essentially accepted it, with barely a whimper. There were no sanctions, no economic blockades, no serious consequences. The money, remarkably, kept flowing into the coffers of the Third Reich. And it gets worse, far worse. Because once Schacht was reinstated at the Reichsbank, he didn't merely resume normal banking operations. He engineered one of the most ingenious and devious financial schemes in history, a clandestine mechanism designed to secretly fund massive German rearmament in direct and blatant violation of the Treaty of Versailles. It was known as the MIFO bill system. Here's how this elaborate deception worked. Schacht created a phantom shell company called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or MEFO for short. On paper, it presented itself as a legitimate metals research firm. In reality, it existed for one singular purpose: to cunningly hide military spending. German arms manufacturers would supply weapons and military equipment to the government. But instead of being paid directly from the official government budget, which would have transparently revealed the true massive scale of rearmament, they were paid with MIFO bills. These were, in essence, IOU notes drawn on the shell company and then secretly guaranteed by the Reichsbank. The MIFO bills could be traded like commercial paper, accepted by banks across the country, and they circulated discreetly through the financial system. And crucially, because they were drawn on a private shell company, they never appeared on the government's official budget. Between 1934 and 1938, the Nazi regime issued roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks in these MIFO bills, financing a massive, unparalleled military buildup while keeping the true scale of spending meticulously hidden from both the German public and the watchful, if often complacent, international community. Now, here's the direct, chilling connection to our story. The international credibility that allowed this system to function, that made these MIFO bills acceptable within the global financial framework. It rested in large part on the profound confidence that the Bank of England and the broader Anglo-American financial establishment had explicitly placed in Schacht. He was, in their eyes, their man. He was the responsible banker. He was the bulwark of civilization against the perceived chaos of post-war Europe. The international financial community's trust in Schacht, a trust painstakingly cultivated over years of personal relationships, shared ideals, and institutional cooperation, provided the perfect, impenetrable cover under which Germany secretly rearmed. Without that trust, without the implicit seal of approval from the financial centers of London and New York, the MIFO bill system might never have been able to sustain itself, and the rearmament might have been exposed far earlier. In August 1934, Adolf Hitler issued a secret memorandum outlining his ambitious four-year plan, a meticulously crafted strategy designed to make the German economy entirely self-sufficient and ready for total war. He admitted privately that this aggressive plan was fundamentally built on the foundation of foreign financial support, and that support, disturbingly, continued to flow without abatement. In August 1934, the entanglement escalated further. The powerful American oil giant Standard Oil, controlled by the Rockefeller family, purchased a staggering 730,000 acres of land in Germany and proceeded to construct large oil refineries that would, with strategic foresight, supply the Nazis with crucial fuel for their war machine. American companies also secretly provided Germany with modern equipment for its rapidly expanding airplane factories. Germany received valuable patents from leading American firms such as Pratt & Whitney, Douglas, and the Bendix Corporation, allowing them to rapidly advance their military aviation technology. The terrifying Junkers 87 Stuka dive bomber, one of the most iconic and terrifying weapons of the early war, was built using a significant amount of this American technology. Also in 1934, Britain, in a move that further cemented its financial ties to the Third Reich, signed the Anglo-German Payments Agreement, which quickly became one of the cornerstones of British economic policy towards Hitler's regime. Under this agreement, the German government committed to earmarking 55% of its export earnings from trade with Britain for financing British exports and services, with an additional 10% allocated specifically to reducing outstanding commercial debts. Germany also, crucially, continued paying full interest on the Dawes and Young Plan bonds held by British investors, effectively safeguarding British financial interests. The Bank of England, to facilitate immediate transfers and ensure the smooth operation of this agreement, extended a credit of £750,000. By facilitating these financial arrangements, the British establishment continued to empower the very regime that would soon plunge the world into darkness. By the late 1930s, the economic landscape of Europe had been dramatically reshaped, with Germany emerging as Britain's paramount trading partner. And this intricate financial web was largely facilitated by influential agents, chief among them the venerable Schroeder Bank. Its London partner, F.C. Tierks, held a uniquely powerful and conflicted position, serving simultaneously as a director of the Bank of England and a prominent member of the Anglo-German Fellowship. This dual role epitomized the intertwined interests that would ultimately blur the lines between diplomacy, finance, and complicity. In a move that further cemented these powerful alliances, Schroeder's New York branch underwent a significant merger in 1936 with a Rockefeller holding, giving birth to the formidable investment bank Schroeder Rockefeller and Company. The sheer magnitude of this new entity did not go unnoticed, with the New York Times, keen observers of global power dynamics, starkly describing it at the time as the economic propagandist axis of Berlin-Rome. This was not merely a business venture, as it signaled a profound, even ideological alignment of financial titans with the rising fascist powers. It's crucial to delve deeper into the Anglo-German Fellowship itself, for this was no obscure assembly of fringe ideologues or eccentric academics. Rather, it functioned as the very beating heart of the British establishment's often disturbing relationship with Nazi Germany. Founded in 1935 amidst a climate of appeasement and economic re-engagement, the Fellowship openly, even proudly, boasted an astonishing roster of members. Among them were 50 members drawn from both houses of the British Parliament, underscoring its significant political reach. 3 directors of the powerful Bank of England were also counted in its ranks, signaling deep integration into the nation's financial nerve center. In its own revealing literature, the Fellowship claimed the membership of many generals, admirals, bishops, and bankers, a cross-section of Britain's military, religious, and financial elite. Beyond individual affiliations, major corporations also held corporate memberships, demonstrating a widespread institutional endorsement. These included global powerhouses like Pricewaterhouse, Unilever, Dunlop Rubber, the travel giant Thomas Cook, Midland Bank, and the esteemed Lazard brothers. Such a powerful and diverse membership base ensured the Fellowship was anything but marginal. It was deeply embedded within the fabric of British power. The Fellowship cultivated strikingly close relationships with several senior Nazi leaders, including the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, and General Werner von Blomberg, the war minister. Lord Rothermere, the fiercely pro-Nazi press baron whose media empire championed Hitler's Germany, personally arranged for the Fellowship's leader to meet Hitler, Goebbels, and Goering face-to-face, solidifying direct lines of communication and influence. By 1937, the Fellowship's membership had swelled to approximately 900, and it had successfully orchestrated numerous landmark meetings between influential British politicians and the Nazi leadership, effectively acting as a direct conduit for diplomatic dialogue with Germany. This organization was instrumental in shaping the political atmosphere in which the policy of appeasement, that ultimately disastrous strategy, could not only flourish but persist long past the point of rational thought or moral sanity. The media environment in Britain during this critical pre-war period was similarly distorted by these pervasive financial and social connections. Geoffrey Dawson, the influential editor of The Times, a newspaper often considered the voice of the establishment, was himself a member of the Anglo-German Fellowship. He was later starkly accused by his own correspondents of actively suppressing vital reports concerning Nazi militarism and rearmament. Norman Ebbett, The Times' courageous German correspondent, recounted how his urgent dispatches detailing Germany's rapid military buildup were consistently watered down or spiked. This meant that the crucial information the British public received about the true nature and aggressive intentions of the Nazi regime was meticulously filtered, if not outright censored, through a network deeply compromised by financial and personal ties to Germany, thus creating a dangerously complacent public discourse. While the British public was being kept in the dark by a compromised press, the industrial engines of the West were already being integrated into the very fabric of the German war machine. This silence provided the perfect cover for the sophisticated financial machinery of international capital to continue its relentless hum. Between Hitler's ascent to power in 1933 and the eve of war in 1939, German industry received massive infusions of foreign capital and cutting-edge technology. These injections directly fueled Germany's military readiness, transforming its industrial capacity into an engine for war. The infamous IG Farben chemical cartel, a sprawling industrial conglomerate, would later achieve notoriety for producing synthetic fuel, synthetic rubber, both critical for a modern war machine, and, most horrifically, the Zyklon B gas used in the death camps. This monstrous entity had extensive and lucrative partnerships with major American companies, most notably Standard Oil, with whom Farben even maintained a joint venture specifically focused on synthetic fuel technology. Other American industrial giants were equally embedded. Ford Motor Company operated a thriving subsidiary in Germany, which became a key producer of vehicles for the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces. General Motors owned Opel, a German automobile manufacturer that rapidly transformed into one of Germany's largest producers of military trucks. Even IBM, through its German subsidiary Die Homag, provided the crucial Hollerith punch card machines that the Nazis meticulously utilized to organize census data, and later, chillingly, to manage the logistics of the vast concentration camp system, including the systematic identification and tracking of victims. These American investments, far from slowing, kept flowing, even as Germany's aggressive intentions became horrifyingly transparent and undeniable on the world stage. By 1941, when the war was raging across Europe, American investment in the German economy collectively totaled an estimated $475 million. Standard Oil alone had poured in $120 million, General Motors $35 million, ITT $30 million, and Ford $17.5 million. These were not abstract financial instruments or speculative portfolios. These were tangible factories, refineries, and assembly lines directly producing the materials, vehicles, fuel, infrastructure that were used to wage a brutal war. None of this complicity, this profound entanglement, occurred in a vacuum. It was the predictable, albeit horrifying, culmination of a carefully constructed financial architecture built in the 1920s. The institutional relationships cultivated at the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. The deep personal bonds between powerful figures like Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, and Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's central banker, and the numerous trade agreements painstakingly negotiated between London and Berlin. All these elements converged to create an intricate web of economic interdependence. This web made it extraordinarily difficult, if not seemingly impossible, for any single government to simply sever ties and cut Germany off, as even when the moral case for doing so became overwhelmingly clear and urgent. Montagu Norman himself was a central figure in this web, his personal connections blurring the lines between professional duty and private loyalty. In January 1939, just 2 months before the chilling invasion of Czechoslovakia, Norman made a highly symbolic and deeply personal journey to Berlin. His purpose? To attend the christening of Schacht's grandson, a child named Norman in his honor. This was more than a social visit. It was a profound gesture of friendship and allegiance. The historian Liaquat Ahmed, in his magisterial work, Lords of Finance, starkly reveals Norman's mindset, writing that Norman openly admired Schacht, and during the early years of Nazi rule, even the achievements of Hitler. Ahmed recounts a particularly damning anecdote. Norman reportedly told a Morgan partner with apparent conviction that Hitler and Schacht are the bulwarks of civilization in Germany. Such a statement from the head of Britain's central bank offers a chilling window into the depth of his pro-German sympathies. But Norman's admiration for the Nazi regime was about to transcend mere words of praise. It would soon manifest in a cold-blooded financial maneuver that would provide Hitler with the ultimate prize, the stolen wealth of a conquered nation. This brings us to arguably the single most damning episode in the Bank of England's convoluted relationship with Nazi Germany, an episode so scandalous, so profoundly compromising, that the bank meticulously kept its details buried deep within its archives for nearly 75 years. The brazen theft of Czechoslovakia's national gold reserves. In March 1939, German troops marched into Prague, executing the military occupation of a sovereign democratic nation. This act was carried out without any credible justification, relying solely on Hitler's absurd and expansionist claim that Bohemia and Moravia had for thousands of years belonged to the living space of the German people. The Czech government, having already seen the storm gathering in the wake of the catastrophic Munich Agreement the previous September, which had shamefully handed the Sudetenland to Germany, began to take desperate precautions with their precious national gold reserves. They shrewdly deposited 23 tons of gold, comprising 1,450 gleaming gold bars with the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, in Basel, Switzerland. The belief was that the BIS's international legal protections, rooted in its status as a central bank of central banks, would keep this vital asset safely beyond Nazi reach. However, in a fateful logistical detail, the BIS, despite its global mandate, possessed no secure vaults of its own. Consequently, this considerable hoard of Czech gold was physically stored, ironically, in the impregnable vaults of the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street in London. When the Nazis seized Prague, one of their immediate and ruthlessly efficient actions was to dispatch armed soldiers directly to the Czech National Bank. Its terrified directors were then ordered at gunpoint to sign transfer requests. The first instruction, issued under duress, directed the BIS to move 23.1 metric tons of gold from the Czech BIS account to the Reich Bank BIS account. Critically, both of these accounts were held physically at the Bank of England. A second, equally coerced instruction ordered the Bank of England itself to transfer another 27 tons from the Czech National Bank's own account directly to the BIS gold account, also at the Bank of England. The Nazis were not demanding gold be physically shipped across international borders. They were simply demanding that numbers be changed in ledger books, all within the same building, in the same vaults, on the same street in London. And here lies the critical, almost unbelievable point of institutional betrayal. The BIS chairman at that time was Otto Niemeyer, himself a director of the Bank of England. And the governor of the Bank of England was, of course, the deeply controversial Montagu Norman. Both men were known to harbor sympathies for the Nazi regime, and Norman's membership in the pro-Nazi Anglo-German Fellowship cast a long, dark shadow. The BIS, under Niemeyer, promptly forwarded the transfer request to the Bank of England. Without hesitation, Montagu Norman authorized the transfer. This vast sum of gold was valued at £5.6 million in 1939, an amount equivalent to roughly $1.1 billion in today's money. The transfer was executed just days after the brutal Nazi invasion, and shockingly, despite the fact that the British government had already issued an explicit order freezing all Czech assets held in Britain. The Bank of England simply ignored its own government's freeze order, brazenly arguing that BIS protocols somehow took precedence over British law. Albrecht Ritschl, a distinguished professor of economic history at the London School of Economics, described this episode in devastating terms. He asserted that the Bank of England acted in cold blood, and pretending not to know what these accounts were and where the gold was coming from, agreed to the transfer. Historian David Blazer, from the University of New South Wales, who meticulously spent years researching the Bank of England's internal memos on this very episode, has unequivocally confirmed that there is absolutely no doubt that the bank knew which numbered BIS account belonged to which central bank. The bank's internal records chillingly show that officials, while suspected the accounts were Czech and German, considered it no business of theirs since both accounts were formally held by the BIS. This reveals a deliberate, institutional detachment from moral responsibility. After the gold was seamlessly transferred between accounts, roughly £4 million was then sent to the central banks of Belgium and the Netherlands, and the substantial remainder was sold off on the London gold market, effectively monetizing stolen assets for the Nazis. Then, in June 1939, in an act of breathtaking audacity, the Bank of England sold yet another tranche of looted gold on behalf of the Reichsbank. This time, perhaps sensing the growing unease, Norman did refer the matter to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who expressed a desire for the opinion of the law officers. But when the BIS, displaying a remarkable sense of entitlement, inquired about the delay and expressed concern about inconvenience, the Bank of England, with Norman's implicit approval, went ahead with the transaction without waiting for the promised legal opinion. The law officers, in a subsequent and equally troubling development, upheld the action anyway, retrospectively legitimizing the transfer. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir John Simon, wrote to Norman in May 1939, directly asking whether the bank still held any Czech gold. Norman, in a stunning act of deliberate obfuscation, evasively answered the question. According to the bank's own internal records, Norman did not answer the question, but pointed out that the bank held gold from time to time for the BIS and had no knowledge of whether it was their own property or that of their customers. This was a blatant and calculated deception. But Norman knew exactly what had happened to the gold. He chose to deliberately obscure the truth from the elected government of his own nation. But while Norman succeeded in deceiving the Chancellor, he could not silence the rising tide of outrage within the halls of Parliament. In the House of Lords, The debate surrounding these revelations was furious, reflecting the outrage felt by many. Brendan Bracken, the impassioned Member of Parliament for North Paddington, declared on May 27, 1939, with prophetic urgency, that transferring this gold to Nazi gangsters was to sanction the most notorious outrage of this generation, the rape of Czechoslovakia. Lord members, aghast, pointed out the stark hypocrisy of the bank's position. They cited previous cases. In the instance of Martin's Bank, which had held £1.25 million in Bank of Spain money during the Spanish Civil War, the bank had laudably refused to release the funds when directors believed to be acting under duress had requested them. Similarly, after the Anschluss, when Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany, Austrian deposits in London banks had been promptly frozen as British institutions recognized that the new directors were operating under Nazi coercion. The very same standard, the same moral imperative, could easily have been applied to the Czech case, but it demonstrably wasn't. And why not? The answer, devastating in its simplicity, was that the Bank of England, under Montagu Norman, clearly valued its sacrosanct relationship with the BIS and its exalted position as the world's leading financial center more than it valued the sovereignty of a conquered democratic nation or, indeed, the stated policy of its own government. This stolen gold mattered enormously to Hitler's rapidly accelerating war preparations. Nazi Germany was desperately short of gold reserves, which were absolutely essential to finance the crucial importation of raw materials, petroleum, metals, and other strategic commodities for its relentlessly expanding war machine. Just 3 months after the last batch of Czech gold was callously sold through London, on September 1, 1939, the German army invaded Poland, igniting the inferno of the Second World War. The capital and credit facilitated through these Anglo-German channels provided Germany with the essential resources to rapidly expand its military-industrial capacity. As the first bombs fell on Poland and the world plunged into darkness, the windowless fortresses of finance did not close their doors. Instead, the silent machinery of international capital found a way to thrive within the eye of the storm. Even after war irrevocably broke out, the deep-seated financial connections did not simply sever. Instead, they persisted, grotesquely, through the very institution that Norman and Schacht had so meticulously built, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. The BIS, safely ensconced in neutral Switzerland, continued to operate throughout the entire brutal war, a testament to its extraordinary, almost surreal, legal immunities. Its board, unbelievably, included representatives from nations that were literally bombing each other into oblivion. German directors sat, at least in theory, alongside their British and French counterparts, though the belligerents ceased attending board meetings in person after June 1939. The American president of the BIS throughout the war was Thomas McKittrick, a figure whose wartime activities would later raise serious questions. McKittrick oversaw an institution that continued to conduct business, and including highly sensitive foreign exchange deals, with the Reichsbank throughout the conflict. A Wall Street banker by trade, McKittrick had previously worked for the British-American Tobacco Company and possessed deep, influential ties to both Allied and Axis financial circles. He traveled freely, even casually, through Nazi territory and Mussolini's Italy during the war years. In 1943, a German U-boat in the Atlantic received explicit orders not to interfere with a ship carrying him back to New York for highly important meetings. He was, according to declassified OSS documents, assigned the code name 644 and served as a crucial conduit between Washington and Berlin, sharing valuable economic intelligence about German morale and Hitler's strategies with key figures like Allen Dulles, who ran the OSS station in Switzerland. Under McKittrick's watch, the BIS willingly accepted vast quantities of looted Nazi gold, executed complex foreign exchange deals for the Reichsbank, and chillingly recognized the Nazi invasions and annexations of conquered countries by allowing ownership shares to transfer to the new puppet governments installed by the Third Reich. At its peak, the Axis powers controlled an astonishing 64% of the BIS's voting shares, giving them effective control over this supposedly neutral international body. The BIS board members during the war included some of the most notorious figures in Nazi finance and industry. Hermann Schmitz, the CEO of IG Farben, the industrial giant whose subsidiary manufactured Zyklon B, the gas used to murder millions in the death camps, sat on the BIS board and exchanged cordial New Year's greetings with McKittrick. Baron Kurt von Schroeder, head of the Steinbank and a leading financier of the Gestapo, was also a director. Walter Funk and Emil Pohl of the Reichsbank, Hitler's personal appointees to the board, were active participants. During the war, the BIS accepted 3.7 tons of gold directly from the Reichsbank. Post-war investigations starkly revealed that this gold had been systematically looted from the central banks of Belgium and the Netherlands, then remelted at the Prussian Mint to expertly conceal its origin. Beyond accepting stolen gold, the BIS facilitated critical foreign exchange transactions that provided Nazi Germany with the hard currency it desperately needed to buy essential raw materials from neutral countries like Sweden, Portugal, and Spain. Without Swedish iron ore, vital for German steel production, Portuguese tungsten, critical for armor-piercing shells, and Spanish manganese, indispensable for special alloys, the German war machine would undoubtedly have ground to a halt. The BIS, through its sophisticated channels, actively helped keep it running. This exposes the dark paradox of financial neutrality. In the world of high finance, neutrality is often a euphemism for moral detachment. By prioritizing the preservation of international banking relationships and debt repayments over the human cost of a genocide, the BIS functioned as a self-preserving organism, one that viewed the stability of the ledger as more sacred than the sanctity of human life. But the complicity went beyond strategic materials. It extended into a financial cycle so dark it bordered on the absurd. And here lies a twisted, almost unbelievable irony that remains largely unknown to the general public. The Reichsbank actually paid interest to the BIS on its pre-war investments, and those interest payments were then redistributed as dividends to BIS shareholders, a group that included, incredibly, the Bank of England. Through this insidious mechanism, Nazi Germany was indirectly contributing to Britain's wartime economy. It was, truly, a banker's war. Even as the war intensified, and despite his earlier complicity, Montagu Norman himself finally notified McKittrick in January 1942 that Britain would no longer countenance gold shipments from the BIS to Portugal, which had by then become one of the primary channels for laundering looted Nazi gold. However, this intervention, while significant, was narrow in scope and came years into the devastating conflict, long after immense and irreparable damage had been done. The U.S. government, for its part, was growing increasingly suspicious. In 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, alarmed by reports, personally asked Winston Churchill, who in turn asked Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, to investigate serious allegations that Norman harbored Nazi sympathies. The investigation was explicitly triggered by American officials who had been tracking Norman's behavior with mounting alarm. A specific concern was a charge that Norman had met Schacht in neutral Sweden in May 1941, well after the war had begun and Britain was locked in a life-or-death struggle. U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had been particularly vocal in his concerns about Norman's conduct. His diaries, later declassified, contain extensive, damning notes on the subject. Morgenthau's files recorded that Norman has always stood in season and out of season for an understanding with Germany and has always regarded as inevitable the unification of the Germanic parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire with Germany. This was not idle gossip or speculation. It was a formal, chilling assessment by one of America's most senior officials about the governor of Britain's central bank, meticulously recorded in an official government diary during wartime. When Eden pressed Norman about his wartime relationship with Schacht, Norman defensively claimed he hadn't seen Schacht in over a year. Churchill found this defense wholly inadequate, given that the war had already been raging for nearly 3 years at that point. The mere fact that Norman's benchmark for acceptable behavior was meeting the former Nazi finance minister only once during a global conflict speaks volumes about his deeply compromised mindset. But the investigation, perhaps due to the delicate wartime alliance between Britain and America, apparently went no further. The stakes of the alliance were considered too high to risk a public scandal involving the governor of the Bank of England. By 1944, the BIS's extensive complicity was becoming impossible to ignore on the international stage. At the pivotal Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944, where the Allied nations gathered to design the post-war international monetary system, the Norwegian delegation proposed a resolution calling for the outright abolition of the BIS at the earliest possible moment. The resolution was adopted, a clear indication that the delegates, representing nations ravaged by war, understood that the institution had been profoundly compromised. It had served not as a neutral arbiter, but as a sophisticated laundering machine for stolen gold and a crucial financial lubricant for the Nazi war effort. Yet, despite this clear international mandate, the BIS was never abolished. European central bankers, many of them the very same figures who had enabled its wartime activities and benefited from its neutrality, successfully lobbied behind the scenes to keep it alive. By 1948, the liquidation resolution, a solemn commitment made by the Allied powers, had been quietly shelved, a testament to the enduring power of vested interests. The BIS survived, restructured, and remarkably, it continues to operate today, headquartered in the same discreet city of Basel, still functioning as the central bank of central banks, and still operating with extraordinary legal immunities that place it above national laws. The survival of the BIS was not an isolated miracle of institutional resilience. It was mirrored by the seamless and often rewarded post-war lives of the men who had steered it through the darkness. The post-war fates of the key players further illustrate the profound moral compromises and whitewashing that followed. Thomas McKittrick, after stepping down as BIS president in 1946, was promptly appointed vice president of Chase National Bank in New York, the powerful Rockefeller Bank. It was, as many observers noted with cynical detachment, presumably a mark of gratitude for his wartime services. He was even decorated by the Belgian government with the Royal Order of the Crown of Belgium for his friendly attitude to Belgium and his services during the war, the very government whose gold reserves he had, in essence, helped to launder. When McKittrick died in 1970, the New York Times obituary respectfully lauded him as a world financier, but conspicuously said nothing about his role in facilitating genocide. Hjalmar Schacht, despite playing a crucial role in financing Hitler's rise, engineering the economic miracle that gave the Nazi regime a veneer of legitimacy, and even helping to organize the petition of industrialists that pressured President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor, was acquitted at Nuremberg. This acquittal was particularly favored by the British judges on the tribunal. He died a free man in 1970, at the ripe old age of 93, his complicity unpunished. Montagu Norman quietly retired as governor of the Bank of England in 1944 after his health deteriorated. He was then elevated to the peerage as the first Baron Norman, a symbol of establishment reward. He died in 1950 after an injury sustained during a walk on his brother's country estate. His official obituaries universally praised his decades of distinguished service to British banking, but made no mention whatsoever of the stolen Czech gold, his troubling Nazi sympathies, or his intimate role as godfather to Schacht's grandchildren. Even after his death, the Bank of England's own internal history of the wartime period, written in 1950, acknowledged that the Czech gold incident still rankled at the outbreak of war and for some time afterwards. Yet, the authors wrote with breathtaking understatement that outside the bank and the government, the bank's position has probably never been thoroughly appreciated, and their action at the time was widely misunderstood. Widely misunderstood. The bank's own historians chose to characterize the deliberate transfer of a conquered nation's sovereign gold to its brutal conquerors as a simple misunderstanding. The archives containing these damning records were only published digitally for the first time in 2013, nearly 75 years after the events they described. And when they were finally released, they revealed private letters and telephone conversations in which bank officials had deliberately and systematically avoided direct questions from the elected government about their actions. In a symbolic act of reckoning, when Mark Carney took over as governor of the Bank of England in 2013, one of his first acts was to remove Montagu Norman's portrait from the wall of the Monetary Policy Committee's meeting room. Adam Posen, a former rate setter at the bank, famously quipped that whenever he couldn't decide which way to vote on interest rates, he would look at the giant portrait of Norman and ask himself, what would Montagu do? Then confidently do the opposite. It's also worth reflecting on the staggering scale of the wartime gold laundering operation facilitated by this network. From April 1938 to May 1945, the Nazis seized nearly $800 million in gold from conquered nations. Belgium alone lost gold worth $223 million. The Netherlands lost $164 million. Austria lost $46 million. Czechoslovakia lost $33 million. France lost $53 million. Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, and Luxembourg lost tens of millions more. By most estimates, roughly 2/3 of the total stolen gold, approximately $660 million in 1940s value, an amount equivalent to roughly $7.8 billion today, passed through neutral Switzerland during the war, much of it facilitated by the BIS's banking channels and its close relationship with the Swiss National Bank. This looted gold was, in essence, blood money, directly used to buy the vital raw materials that kept Germany's armies in the field and its factories churning out weaponry. Portugal, one of the primary recipients of this laundered gold, saw its exports to Germany climb dramatically, from just 1.79% of total Portuguese trade in 1940 to an astonishing 24.38% by 1942, as Germany increasingly paid for wolfram, tungsten, a metal critical for armor-piercing shells, with gold funneled through the BIS system. Sweden's high-quality iron ore, absolutely essential for German steel production, was similarly financed. The sophisticated financial system that Norman and Schacht had so diligently helped build in the 1920s and 1930s was thus used, in the 1940s, to sustain one of the most destructive military campaigns in human history. And when the war finally ended, the accounting for this vast, morally tainted enterprise was never fully settled. The Allies established a tripartite gold commission to recover looted monetary gold, and the BIS did eventually return a paltry 3.7 tons in 1948, a minuscule fraction of what it had handled. But vast quantities had already been irretrievably dispersed through Portugal, Sweden, Spain, Turkey, and other neutral countries, vanishing into the global financial ether. The Swiss government, which had accepted hundreds of millions in Nazi gold, it continued to cling to its pretense of neutrality. The Swiss government, which had directly accepted hundreds of millions in Nazi gold, shamelessly continued to champion its pretense of neutrality. Its central bank, having facilitated the illicit transfer of untold sums of German gold, eventually consented to a paltry settlement of just $58 million in 1946, a sum barely a fraction of the immense wealth it had illicitly managed and monetized. Similarly, the Portuguese central bank, strategically positioned and economically indispensable, clung to its substantial German gold reserves for years, leveraging its unique diplomatic and commercial standing to dramatically reduce any Allied demands for restitution. Tragically, a significant portion of this plundered wealth simply dissolved into the intricate web of the global financial system, meticulously laundered and recategorized beyond any hope of recovery or accountability. Even more disturbingly, the very individuals who orchestrated and enabled these vast illicit financial operations did not face justice or retribution. Far from being punished, they were instead rewarded and elevated. S. Parker Gilbert, for example, a key figure in implementing the Dawes Plan and later an American agent general for reparations, moved seamlessly into a senior role at J.P. Morgan, embodying the revolving door between government and high finance. Less known, but equally significant, George McKittrick, an American financier heavily involved in European finance during this period, landed a prestigious position at Chase National Bank. Perhaps the most egregious example was Per Jakobsson, a distinguished Swedish economist who had worked hand in glove with Montagu Norman and the BIS leadership throughout the war, a leadership deeply implicated with Nazi financial dealings. Jakobsson's career ascended even further. In 1956, he was appointed the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, an institution ostensibly created to foster global financial stability. The deep institutional knowledge, the intricate personal networks, and the fundamental financial architecture that had underpinned this wartime complicity all survived intact. It wasn't dismantled. It was merely repackaged and rebranded, seamlessly adapting to the new geopolitical imperatives of the burgeoning Cold War era. The seamless transition of these figures into post-war leadership roles illustrates the concept of institutional memory. These men weren't just bankers. They were the architects of the global financial plumbing. The system protected them because it needed their expertise to function. This established a recurring pattern in history. The elite networks that navigate a crisis are almost always the ones chosen to design the aftermath, ensuring that the fundamental structures of power remain unchanged. This was not a failure of justice. It was a triumph of a financial architecture designed to be untouchable. Of course, to assert that the Bank of England alone was singularly responsible for initiating World War II would be a grave and intellectually dishonest oversimplification. Adolf Hitler's monstrous ambitions were unequivocally his own, fueled by a virulent ideology of racial supremacy and territorial expansion. German society, in turn, harbored its own profound pathologies, a complex brew of resentment, nationalism, and historical grievance. The catastrophic failures of the Versailles Treaty, the debilitating weakness of the League of Nations, the pervasive cowardice of appeasement policies across Europe, and the repeated miscalculations of democratic leaders, all these factors converged, creating a perfect storm that inexorably led to global catastrophe. Moreover, the financial ecosystem of the era was vast and interconnected, involving a multitude of other powerful actors, from the titans of Wall Street to the discreet vaults of Swiss banks and the influential industrialists of Sweden. Nevertheless, the irrefutable evidence lays bare a stark truth. The Bank of England, under the resolute and often inscrutable leadership of Montagu had played a profoundly pivotal and deliberate role in meticulously crafting the financial conditions that empowered Nazi Germany. It was the economic lifeblood that allowed the Third Reich to rearm with frightening speed, to consolidate its tyrannical power internally, and to systematically prepare for a devastating war on an unprecedented scale. This assistance manifested through a myriad of channels, through the initial Dawes and Young plans, which stabilized Germany's economy and facilitated an influx of foreign capital, indirectly freeing up domestic resources for military buildup. Through direct loans and preferential credit arrangements that funded key industries essential for rearmament. Through the controversial Anglo-German Payments Agreement, which effectively prioritized German trade and financial stability even as Hitler's aggressive intentions became undeniable. Through the very establishment and continued operation of the Bank for International Settlements, BOIS, a supranational financial institution designed to operate with alarming immunity from democratic oversight, often serving as a clandestine conduit for central bank cooperation, even between belligerents. Through the deeply personal and ideologically aligned friendship between Norman and Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's economic maestro, which allowed for informal channels of communication and collaboration outside official government purview, and, most brazenly, through the utterly indefensible transfer of Czechoslovakia's stolen gold to the Reichsbank, an act of direct material aid to a hostile power, directly violating international law and moral principles. The Bank of England, through these deliberate actions and policies, effectively supplied the critical economic oxygen that kept the Nazi war machine breathing during its most formative and vulnerable years of growth and consolidation. Montagu Norman's worldview was remarkably consistent, chillingly clear, and deeply influential. He perceived Nazi Germany not as a nascent threat, but as a vital bulwark against the terrifying specter of communism. He viewed it as a necessary stabilizing force in the turbulent landscape of Central Europe, and indeed, as a valuable business partner. His personal animosity toward France, rooted in post-World War I reparations debates and a deep-seated contempt for French political instability, often overshadowed any perceived threat from Germany. Fundamentally, Norman believed, with an almost religious fervor, that central bankers should operate with absolute independence from elected democratic governments. He held that the cold, impersonal logic of markets and the sacred preservation of financial institutions should invariably take precedence over transient political considerations, moral qualms, or national security concerns. He acted upon these convictions with an unwavering resolve, leading to consequences of unimaginable human cost. The profound lesson embedded within this harrowing historical narrative extends far beyond the actions of a single man or the policies of one institution. It speaks to the inherent and terrifying power of unaccountable financial systems to unilaterally shape the fate and future of entire nations. The Bank of England, during this period, operated with a degree of autonomy from the elected British government that was not only extraordinary but also deeply problematic. This unchecked independence allowed it to pursue policies that the democratically elected government might never have sanctioned, and indeed, might not even have been fully aware of. When the Chancellor of the Exchequer made inquiries regarding the infamous Czech gold, Norman responded with a calculated lie of omission. When the British government formally froze Czech assets in London, the bank brazenly transferred them anyway. When the BIS issued demands, the Bank of England habitually prioritized the dictates of this international, unelected body over the explicit instructions and interests of its own sovereign government. And this is the perilous reality of what transpires when financial power is permitted to operate cloaked in shadows, when central bankers perceive themselves as answerable only to each other rather than to the public they ostensibly serve, and when the preservation of institutional relationships and abstract market stability is accorded a higher moral standing than the sanctity of human life and the imperatives of national security. The ultimate consequences of these cold, financial calculations were not merely tallied in pounds sterling or US dollars. They were measured in the unfathomable currency of human lives. 6 million Jews systematically murdered in the Holocaust. A staggering 60 million people perished in the brutal conflict itself. Entire cities across continents were reduced to smoldering rubble. Countless families were utterly annihilated, their histories erased. And somewhere amidst this global wreckage, the very gold bars that once constituted the sovereign wealth and personal savings of the people of Czechoslovakia were melted down, meticulously restamped to obscure their provenance, and circulated through the world financial system, as if their origin had never been tainted by theft and atrocity. Some of the greatest atrocities in the annals of human history were not solely made possible by the men who pulled triggers on the battlefield, but equally by the seemingly distant, irrespectable figures who signed the checks in quiet, oak-paneled offices. These were the men in their dignified suits, some perhaps adopting false names, attending christenings in Berlin, forging connections with the grandchildren of their colleagues, and approving transfers in meticulously kept ledger books. They never once set foot on a battlefield. But the very battlefields themselves were funded, constructed, and sustained by their money. Yet, as the bank's immense power was not always wielded in the shadows of neutrality. As the world moved into the late 20th century, the Bank of England transitioned into an overt weapon of statecraft. A stark example emerged from the bank's own declassified archives regarding the 1982 Falklands crisis. When war broke out with Argentina, the bank didn't just manage the national accounts, it actively participated in economic warfare. By swiftly executing policy sanctions, freezing Argentine assets, and blocking trade balances, the bank demonstrated a new era of central banking. One where its financial supremacy was deployed directly on the front lines of international conflict. This is the hidden history of the Bank of England and World War II. It was not hidden because it was unknowable or because records didn't exist. Rather, it was hidden because the very individuals and institutions who controlled the narrative also controlled the powerful organs that disseminated history. For decades, they collectively chose a convenient, self-serving silence. Yet, history possesses an indomitable way of surfacing, of asserting itself, even from the deepest, most secure vaults, even from behind the formidable windowless walls of Threadneedle Street. So, the next time someone confidently asserts that wars are solely the domain of politicians and generals fought exclusively over abstract ideologies and territorial claims, remember this: wars are also funded by bankers. They are fueled by the clandestine movement of gold between numbered accounts, sealed by quiet handshakes in private offices, orchestrated by men who never fire a shot, but whose signatures on crucial papers make every shot possible. And the very institutions that enabled this colossal tragedy, the Bank of England, the Bank for International Settlements, the venerable investment houses of London and Wall Street, did not merely survive the war. They thrived. They expanded their reach. as their influence and their power emerging from the ashes of conflict, stronger and more entrenched than ever before. But this enduring power did not remain frozen in its pre-war mold. The very shadows that once protected Montagu Norman's secrets eventually gave way to a demand for public light. However, to assert that the Bank of England's structure remains completely unchanged and unaccountable today would overlook decades of sweeping modern reforms. In stark contrast to Montagu Norman's secretive era, the contemporary Bank of England is governed by a multi-layered architecture designed to ensure transparency and democratic oversight. At the apex sits the Court of Directors, a unitary board comprising executive leaders, including the governor and 4 deputy governors, and a majority of non-executive directors appointed by the Crown. This court is responsible for managing the bank's affairs, determining its strategy, and allocating its budget. Crucially, policy-making power is no longer concentrated in the hands of a single, unchecked governor. Instead, it is distributed across specialized, statutory committees that blend internal expertise with independent, external members appointed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, is established when the bank gained operational independence in 1997, is tasked with meeting the government's 2% inflation target through the transparent setting of the bank rate. Meanwhile, following the 2008 financial crisis, the Financial Policy Committee, FPC, was created to identify and monitor macroprudential systemic risks to protect the entire UK financial system. This works in tandem with the Prudential Regulation Committee, PRC, which oversees the Prudential Regulation Authority's, PRA, microprudential supervision of individual banks and insurers to ensure their safety and soundness. Today, these committees are legally required to publish detailed records of their meetings and regularly explain their actions to parliamentary bodies, such as the Treasury Committee, representing a profound institutional shift from the opaque operations of the 1930s. Yet, even in this era of supposed transparency, the bank has not been immune to the shadows of the financial markets. In 2014, the institution faced a severe test of its integrity when allegations surfaced that its staff might have been aware of, or complicit in, the manipulation of the global foreign exchange, FX, markets. Unlike the buried secrets of the 1930s, this modern crisis prompted an independent investigation led by Lord Grabiner QC. While the resulting report concluded that no bank officials were involved in unlawful behavior, and it exposed uncomfortable truths about the bank's market intelligence gathering and internal oversight. In response, the bank was forced to overhaul its internal culture, introducing a strict ethical framework known as Our Code, and establishing a central compliance function, a stark admission that the guardians of the financial system must themselves be rigorously guarded. Nevertheless, transparency does not equate to immunity, and this modern architecture now faces its most rigorous test against a new generation of global crises. Today, this modern architecture is rigorously tested not by the secret funding of empires, but by the highly public management of volatile macroeconomic forces. In the mid-2020s, the bank's Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, faces a delicate balancing act to tame inflation and steer it back to the statutory 2% target. Following a severe inflationary spike, the MPC has been engaged in a cautious easing cycle, holding the bank rate at 3.75% in early 2026 amidst persistent wage growth and services inflation. Concurrently, the bank has been unwinding its massive historical balance sheet through quantitative tightening, QT, recently slowing the pace of government bond sales to £70 billion a year to prevent instability in long-term borrowing costs. However, these carefully calibrated domestic policies remain constantly vulnerable to external geopolitical shocks. These carefully calibrated domestic policies remain perpetually vulnerable to external geopolitical shocks. Sudden escalations in volatile regions or unpredictable swings in global energy prices can immediately threaten to upend the UK's disinflationary progress, forcing economic forecasts to be constantly revised. It serves as a stark reminder that while the bank now operates with modern transparency, its mission of maintaining economic stability remains at the mercy of an inherently unpredictable world. It serves as a stark reminder that while the bank now operates in the light of day, its task of maintaining economic stability remains at the mercy of an unpredictable world. Beyond the highly visible arena of interest rates, the bank's modern mandate extends deeply into the very wiring of the economy through its role in supervision and financial stability. Acting as the UK's ultimate guardian against systemic collapse, the bank operates through distinct, powerful arms. The Financial Policy Committee, FPC, scans the horizon for macroprudential threats, such as vulnerabilities in market-based finance or sovereign debt pressures, ensuring the financial system as a whole can absorb shocks. Simultaneously, the Prudential Regulation Authority, PRA, dives into the microprudential details, rigorously supervising individual banks, insurers, and major investment firms to ensure their safety and soundness. Furthermore, serving as the UK's resolution authority, the bank now possesses the statutory power to safely wind down failing institutions without relying on taxpayer bailouts, a direct lesson learned from past crises. In the mid-2020s, this supervisory framework is being fiercely tested. At the microprudential level, the bank's modern role has evolved into a highly calibrated balancing act between institutional safety and economic growth. Through the Prudential Regulation Authority, PRA, the bank ensures that individual banks and insurers operate safely and hold sufficient capital shock absorbers to withstand severe market stress. A defining regulatory focus in the mid-2020s is the implementation of the Basel 3.1 capital standards, designed to address the critical shortcomings in risk-weighted asset calculations revealed by the 2008 global financial crisis. However, reflecting a pragmatic approach and its new secondary statutory objective to facilitate the UK economy's international competitiveness and growth, the bank officially delayed the implementation of Basel 3.1 to January 1, 2027. This strategic pause, alongside the introduction of a more proportionate, strong and simple capital regime for smaller domestic deposit takers, demonstrates how the modern bank actively recalibrates its rules to avoid unduly stifling domestic lending or isolating the UK from global markets. But the modern bank is doing more than just governing today's markets through committees. It is fundamentally reimagining the very nature of the currency it issues. As the Bank of England navigates the complexities of the 21st century, it is not only managing current economic shocks, but also actively designing the future of money itself. In a joint effort with HM Treasury, the bank is currently exploring the creation of a retail central bank digital currency, CBDC, known as the digital pound. Rather than replacing physical cash, this digital currency is envisioned as a complement to existing payment methods within a diverse, multi-money system. Currently in a rigorous design phase extending through 2026, the bank is developing a detailed blueprint while experimenting with use cases in the digital pound lab. Crucially, to safeguard financial stability and prevent the sudden flight of deposits from commercial banks, the bank is proposing strict holding limits, such as £10,000 to £20,000 per individual, during any initial rollout. Furthermore, addressing public concerns about surveillance, the bank and the UK government have pledged that primary legislation will guarantee user privacy, ensuring the central bank cannot access personal transaction data. This initiative highlights a modern institution striving to foster digital innovation while maintaining the trust and stability required of public money. However, the digital pound presents a new ethical frontier. In Montagu Norman's era, the central bank used secrecy to shield the activities of the elite from democratic scrutiny. But in the digital age, the risk flips. A central bank currency could potentially allow the institution to scrutinize the activities of the masses. The challenge for the future is not just technological innovation, but ensuring that the financial system's evolution from elite secrecy to mass transparency does not come at the expense of individual liberty. However, this trust is not built on technology alone, as it requires a rigid financial leash to ensure the institution never returns to the unchecked autonomy of its darker years. Underpinning all these modern operations, from setting interest rates to developing digital currencies, is a rigorous financial framework designed to prevent the unchecked autonomy of the past. While the bank gained operational independence in 1997, it is now bound by strict democratic accountability and transparent funding mechanisms. such as the new Bank of England levy introduced in 2024. Furthermore, the 2025 Memorandum of Understanding with HM Treasury explicitly limits the bank's financial autonomy by establishing a strict capital framework with a £3.5 billion target, a £0.5 billion floor, and a £5.5 billion ceiling. Under this agreement, if the bank's loss-absorbing capital exceeds the ceiling, or 100% of its net profits must be returned directly to the Treasury as a dividend, ensuring public funds are rigorously protected. However, the profound tension between financial independence and democratic control is never truly resolved. Following the severe inflation spikes of 2021-2023, scholars and parliamentary committees have increasingly argued for a reassessment of the bank's independence. Critics contend that monetary policy decisions, such as massive quantitative easing and sharp interest rate hikes, inherently create societal winners and losers, and therefore should not be entirely isolated from the political process and the electorate's oversight. This ongoing debate over modern central banking reminds us that international financial systems are often structured in ways that the vast majority of citizens neither see nor understand, rendering them utterly powerless to influence. Looking back, yet the inescapable lesson of Montagu Norman and the Bank of England is not simply that bad people do bad things. It is a far more insidious revelation, even if they somehow did. The inescapable lesson of Montagu Norman and the Bank of England is not simply that bad people do bad things. History suggests that when financial systems are insulated from democratic oversight, they risk prioritizing institutional stability and the interests of capital over broader humanitarian concerns. Norman, yet in his own mind, was not a villain. He genuinely believed he was preserving stability, maintaining order, steadfastly fighting communism, and vigilantly protecting the sacred integrity of the financial system. Yet, at every critical juncture, from his advocacy for the Dawes Plan to his complicity in the transfer of the Czech gold, he was making deliberate choices that incrementally, but decisively, propelled the world closer to an unimaginable catastrophe. This history forces us to confront a vital question. How can modern societies balance the need for central bank independence with the imperative of democratic accountability? Ultimately, the story of the Bank of England is more than a closed chapter in a history book. It is a mirror held up to our present. In a world where algorithms and digital currencies are replacing gold bars and handwritten ledgers, the struggle for control over financial power remains as vital as ever. When we look at the formidable walls of Threadneedle Street or the towers of Basel, we should see more than just monuments of stability. We must recognize them as places where decisions that shape the lives of billions are made every day. The transparency we enjoy today is not a permanent gift. It is a hard-won result of past tragedies, sustained only by ongoing public vigilance. History has shown that when finance is divorced from ethics, and when power is insulated from accountability, the cost is invariably measured in human lives and the future of nations. Understanding this hidden machinery is not just a study of the past. It is our first line of defense in ensuring that the darkest chapters of our financial history are never written again.